this session. Good afternoon. So it's a great pleasure today that we have our seminar by Paolo Graziano. Actually, Valentine will introduce today's speaker later. It's a great pleasure to have Paolo with us. We are actually very happy to have this year a list of very good seminars about this topic. And actually, as you know, so we still have this one plus other two seminars. The next one will be on May 10th by Massimo Relli, Università Bocconi, and last seminar will be on May 24th by Donatella Della Porta, Scuola Normale of Pisa. So we are very pleased. This has been a very exciting intellectual journey. So we had scholars from very different disciplines. We have scholars, international scholar, and actually today I'm sure that we had a great seminar again. And our speaker is Paolo Roberto Graziano, and Valentine will spend a few words introducing our speaker. Thank you, everybody. As usual, this is a webinar. Some of you knows that we had few problems in the past, so now the version is a webinar. So during the talk, if you have any question, you can use question and answer or raise your hand. And then at the end, actually, we hope to have a very lively debate with questions from the audience after Paolo's speech. Thank you again. And now, Valentina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio. I'm very glad to have today as a guest Professor Paolo Graziano, who is a colleague of mine. He's professor of political science at the University of Padova, but he's also a research associate at the European Social Observatory in Brussels and associate at Sciences Po in Paris. He has held several visiting positions in different universities, including Cornell University, the University of Cambridge, the University of Oxford, Sciences Po in Paris, the University of Melbourne, and many others. He is also the co-editor of Governance and past president of the APSA conference group on Italian politics. So his most recent book is Neopopulism in Italian, published by Il Mulino, and he also published extensively on Europeanization, European public policy, social movements, and populist parties in several international journals. And today, if I'm not wrong, he's going to present the most recent outcomes of his research on the origin and consolidation of neopopulisms, a conceptual scheme. So, Paolo, I'm very glad to have you here and leaving you the floor.
Thank you very much. I slightly changed the title, Conceptual Scheme, Framework for Analysis. It's everything that I'm trying to look at in order to go towards a theory of populism, which is still to come. So I would like to thank both Antonio Nicolò and Valentine Lomellini for having me here. And it's going to be a journey that started, I understand, with other colleagues that had more historical perspective, if I got it right, on changes with respect to populism and phases of populism. And then we will have another set of political scientists right after me. So that's going to be, I think, very interesting to see how topics that are today very trendy, such as neopopulism, can be also analyzed under different perspectives, although we come from a very similar scientific disciplines. So what I'd like to do today is basically I will start with the end. This is what I'd like to get to, and I'll try then to go back also, because I would not want to repeat some things that have been said by others in terms of definitions. So I also would like to have some support by both Antonio and Valentine with reference to things that have maybe already been said. I would not want to replicate this. I think is something relatively original because it somehow tries to put together a number of elements that we can find in the literature on populism or neopopulism. I will say a bit more about why I would prefer the use of the term of neopopulism. And I try somehow to put together in one slide a number of elements that have been at the heart of the debates regarding populism today. Why do I, first of all, try to go towards a theory of neopopulism? For three reasons. The first reason is that we have a number of very accurate studies that over the years have done very, very important conceptual work. One of the first problems with the populist literature was what exactly are we talking about when we're focusing on populism. Therefore, we have a number of authors that have looked at how populism could be defined. I'll provide some elements of the definition later on just to make sure that we are on the same page. But please feel more than free, both Antonia and Valentine, to stop me if I'm saying something that has already been discussed, because I said I would not want to repeat things that are already known. So on the one hand, we had concepts and conceptual analysis carried out by several European and non-European scholars. Second, we had lots of analysis of the potential determinants of populism. And here on the left of the slide, you see three groupings of factors that deal with the political crisis, the economic crisis, and the cultural crisis. I'll come back to this later, but we had studies that focused on political factors, economic factors, or cultural factors, which of course could mean many different things. I'll say more later, but we did have a literature, and we do have scholars that focused a lot on explaining how and why populism became so important. And third and last, but again, in looking at the factors, many authors simply were concentrating on some phenomena, limited phenomena, also because it's not that easy to conduct a fully fledged quantitative analysis with a limited number of cases if you're focusing on the parties, and this is what I will do. Of course, the picture is very different if you focus on populist attitudes. So if you're focusing on voters, or you're focusing on electoral outcomes, then the situation is quite different. And here again, we had scholars that were looking at the determinants of votes going towards some parties in some countries. But again, the comparative dimension in terms of countries until very recently was not that developed. Third and finally, on the normative side, we often had a discussion about populism as a threat or an opportunity for democracy. So on the right side of the slide, you see these issues, and I try somehow to put some order, or I suggest a way through which some order could be put in place in order to make a bit more clear what could be the conditions under which populism or neopopulism may become a threat or an opportunity for democracy. So on the first thing I wanted to share is the reason why I'm trying to develop this framework for analysis. Number one, we have lots of very good conceptual work that nevertheless has not yet fed into a theory. We have analysis of determinants that quite often were taken in an isolated way, or were not conducted with large N studies. And third, we have debates about the threat that populism may cause to democracy, or others that also see populism as an opportunity. So somehow what I'm trying to combine is a more input side with reference to how populism originates and consolidates, and also an output side in terms of the impact of populism on the health of regimes, be them democratic or non-democratic. So now I can go back and start with some of the basic data that you may be familiar with. That is the strength of populist parties. Here we have a chart which is a couple of years old, but basically the picture has not changed over the years. And if we take a diachronic perspective, we have a rise of what has been labeled exclusionary populism, which from the 80s till very recent years has increased substantially. This is referred to European countries in particular, where exclusionary populism, as we will see later on, is referred to what otherwise is labeled as right-wing populism. So this is also one of the other elements that we have to consider when we're looking at populism from a theoretical perspective. We should not consider populism only as one type of phenomenon, but it's a series of phenomena that are linked to different forms of populism itself. This is why exclusionary populism is one thing. As we will see, inclusionary populism is something else. So again, this is what we said in terms of background. We do not need to go through it again. We have some literature references in case you're interested. Of course, I'm at your disposal also. I will gladly provide some articles that I've also been working on. I think there is a question. I would not know if we want to deal with them now, or how would you like to proceed? You tell me.
So this is just a clarification question. Was they asking if there is a possibility to have the slides at the end of your talk?
Sure, with pleasure. These are slides that I'm afraid that some of the students have already seen, but years ago, and I'm not sure that many were present. So this is a set of slides I can share with pleasure. It's a very basic introduction to what I'm currently working on. But as said, together with the slides, for those who are interested, I will gladly share some papers that I've worked on, or papers by others, because again, it's really very fascinating. At the same time, it's very vast. Therefore, it's a bit easy at the beginning, at least, to get lost in the literature. So if there's any interest, I would gladly provide some advice on readings and on perspectives, but I'm sure that many others also could do it, so it will be up to you. So let me just start by underlining the reason why I would prefer to talk about neopopulism and not populism. Because populism has been used by historians in a very accurate way, both referring to US political development and Russian political development. In the US, we had the People's Party in the second half of the 19th century, whereas in Russia, we had populist movements that then not necessarily turned into directly a party, although there's a strand of the literature that looks at the link between populism and then the revolution that occurred later in the 20th century. So there is a very important historical material there that has been used in order to define populism in a historically grounded way. So for this reason, also in order to pay the due respect to historians, I would start to question if what we're looking at today can be seen as populism. As I already anticipated, and I will further argue later on, I think we should take other terms, we should go in other directions. We also had political philosophers that, going back to a very famous conference in 1967 that was held at the LSE, tried to cope with other strands of the literature and other parts of the world. As a matter of fact, in the mid-60s, the debate about populism was linked to what was happening in Latin America. For this reason, an author like Ernesto Laclau, who was of Argentinian citizenship and then worked a lot in the UK, were very important in not of course in the conference itself, because the conference was more linked to other philosophers such as Belli and Ionescu. But somehow the work by these political philosophers was carried on by other political philosophers that had in mind, in particular, Ernesto Laclau, who wrote his PhD thesis on Marxism and populism, and in particular having in mind the Argentinian context. They had in mind Latin America. Chantal Mouffe joined later on and produced some very important pieces of work, but more from a political philosophy perspective. And then finally, we have a number of scholars, in particular political scientists, that from the political theory perspective then moved on to the conceptual side, and Mude and Rovira Kalvasser, the most recent, together with Paul Taggart, the most recent well-known scholars that have worked on the concept of populism and the way through which populism has been studied in a number of contexts. So to put it very, very simply, my main concern here is that populism has been used for very different historical moments. And therefore, what today political scientists and also economists look at as populism, I think could be seen more properly as neopopulism, something that therefore is linked to very recent developments in political systems. Therefore, if we take the 80s on, in this period, I would start talking about neopopulism, because the roots, the origins, and the consolidation of populist parties during this period are different from what they were in the past. So a few words about the definition I think are needed. Again, if you already have gone through these topics, just let me know. What I'm trying to do here, even if you already had a definition of populism, is try to combine various strands of research, because we have the leading definition, which is linked to Mood and many others, which is thin-centered ideology. Populism is seen as a thin-centered ideology. That is an ideology that has a very limited center, a very thin center. Or others have seen populism as a communication style. So populism is a way to open up communication interaction between political parties and political party leaders on the one hand, and voters on the other. And finally, populism has seen by scholars as a political strategy, or a specific form of organization based on a strong and personalistic leadership. So if we look at populism as a phenomenon, we have to, first of all, acknowledge the fact that not only has it been defined differently, but it also has had different focuses with reference to the object of the study. So I do think that we should need to somehow put together these three elements and focus on those parties that actually can be defined populist only when all these three conditions are met. So there has to be a thin-centered ideology, there has to be a specific communication style based on a specific rhetoric. I'm not sure we have that much time to go into the details here, but we may do it later on. Populism as a political strategy, therefore, the condition is that a specific political strategy has to be adopted. By the way, this is to a certain extent a broad definition that has also been used by a group of colleagues that have given birth to the Populist, which is a website that some of you may be familiar with, that tries year after year, somehow, it's very recent, it has been built up in the past 2 years. This website tries to keep track of all the populist parties in the European context. And at the end of the day, the definition of populism is not only a thin-centered ideology party, but it's a party that also shares the other definitory elements that we find in this slide. Furthermore, if we want to be a bit more specific, when we're thinking about a thin-centered ideology, we have to be a bit more clear in terms of what kind of a thin-centered ideology we're talking about. Clearly, the people on the one hand, the elite on the other. This is common in all the populist parties, in all the definitions. Empirically speaking, though, it becomes a bit difficult to capture how the parties frame the thin-centered ideology in their electoral manifestos. As a matter of fact, lots of the research and parts of my research as well has been conducted on electoral manifestos in order to understand if this antagonistic relationship between the people on the one hand and the elite is really present or not. Because sometimes there may be some exclamations, there may be some claims about being populistic, but then we may not find correspondence of the claims with respect to the electoral manifestos or the proposals by the party. So a first empirical check, once we have defined populism, is, well, when we look at the parties, when will we actually see that the people are defined as against the elites? And even more so, what will be the people? How can we define the people? This is something that quite often in the literature is a bit overlooked. But as I'll try to argue, if we take the variance in the definition of the people seriously, then we will not have only one type of populism, but we will have different types of populism. But I'll come back to this later on. Third and final element that we need to find in the thin-centered ideology is the conceptualization of the relevance of popular sovereignty, which is one of the goals that the Populist Party is pursuing. Now, if we go back to the other elements that have to be introduced when we try to understand what populism is, let me just spend a few words on the communication style and the political strategy. The communication style is very much connected to the notion of crisis. And crisis is something that is used by the political leaders that go in a populist direction, because it allows them to have the following rhetoric. First of all, the first step of the classic populist rhetoric is we have a big problematic situation, which is typically addressed as a crisis. The point of departure is we are in a critical situation. The second step is something has to be done in order to overcome the critical situation. So in terms of the rhetoric, you start, and this, for example, is very well seen in the speeches that Trump has produced a number of times. We have a critical situation, something has to be done, and the third and final step is, I'm here to save you. I'm the savior, I'm the hero that will allow the situation to not be critical anymore. So it's a very basic, simple communication style based on a three-step rhetoric. Crisis, something has to be done, I'm the one that will do what needs to be done. And we have some scholars that argue that this is the essence of populism. Aslanidis, for example, working at Yale, I would I would consider communication style as part of a broader mosaic, because it would not be enough. Otherwise, every single party could be seen as populist today, because the communication style in terms of framing political activity as a response to a crisis is used very, very often. Now, as a matter of fact, we could argue, and this will come also back towards the end, that today it's very rare that we do not find some populist traits in current political parties, especially throughout Europe. But again, we do not want to do too much concept stretching. So we will just focus on the three elements and eventually come back to the Q&A sessions to the problematization of how populism has been studied. Finally, political strategy, populism as a political strategy, there's a very strong relationship between the leader and the party. Again, personalization and the growing role of leaders in European political parties is something that was there before the populist boom. Indeed, but the populist boom is even more focusing on individuals as political party leaders. So to a certain extent, their individuals as such as leaders are the ones that will make the party and not vice versa. Again, with this respect, we would have a very good example of a new type of populism which has been labeled as techno-populism. For example, Macron, that in France actually created a party from scratch, entirely basing the party on his personality, on his also on his way of seeing reality. And again, it's not by chance that the party by Macron is called En Marche, and EM stand also for Emmanuel Macron. So if you think about it, it's just an anecdote, if you wish, but it shows very much how the personalization of the populist parties, even in those cases which are hybrids, such as Macron's party, is very, very, very important. Now let's go to what has been studied, maybe a bit less by the mainstream populist analyst, which is the definition of the people. Because once we have the definition of the ideology, some authors stop there. Okay, it's just about the people against the elite. Well, it doesn't really work, because the people may have very different meanings. And the meanings we attribute to the people, the different meanings will give birth to different or potentially different types of populism. This is one of the arguments I'm trying to put forward here. So if we work on what has been done by Menis and Sorel in particular, we can see the people as a unitary set of individuals linked by sovereignty goals, or by class identity, or by national identity. And here, I guess you can also start seeing the differences between neo-populist parties, which could be, for example, Syriza in Greece, or Podemos in Spain, from other neo-populist parties, which could be Lega in Italy, or Rassemblement National in France. So they conceptualize differently the people. On the one hand, we have national identity, which is the key connection. On the other hand, it's more a class identity. Now, this is not to say that we may not find, and this is an empirical issue, very important, by the way, that has not been studied that much by political scientists, a bit more by political sociologists. That is that the definitions of people may overlap. So, for example, we start to see in Podemos, for example, an overlap between the definition of people as a unitary set of individuals linked by class identity, and people as a unitary set of people linked by national identity. So we have this strange phenomenon of inclusionary or left-wing nationalism, which is a bit puzzling if we have a unilateral definition of the people as individuals linked by sovereignty goals, as opposed to those united, kept together by class identity. Again, the reality is much more mixed than we may see it just defining the options. But nevertheless, thanks to these ideal types, this is really the purpose of ideal types, we can develop research strategies in a more accurate way in order to differentiate among different types of neopopulisms. So again, no need to add this slide. I already made the point. I think we can move on. Neopopulism is more accurate than populism for the reasons I already mentioned. So here, moving towards the second and then last part of the presentation, we said different definitions of the people, thin-centered ideology, which is based on an antagonistic relationship between the people and the elite. A footnote here. On the elite dimension, not much has been said. But also, if you focus on the elite is also a moving target. Elites are not defined once and for all by the neo-populist parties. Just think, for example, about some neo-populist parties that once in power cannot accuse the government of being elite because they're in power. So they would be accusing themselves. It would be, of course, paradoxical. So what happens is that they need to change the target of the elite against which they're fighting. And as a matter of fact, we've seen this very clearly in a number of neo-populist governments. For example, Salvini doing this, increasing the criticism towards European institutions once in government, because it could not be said anymore that the national governments, the old governments were to be accused, because again, they were talking about the 2018-2019 neo-populist Italian government. They were in government, so they could not accuse themselves. Again, and this happens, this is a pattern that you find for all those neo-populist parties that do go in government. They need to find new enemies. They do, because otherwise they would lose some of this antagonistic opportunity, which also pays substantially in electoral terms. They can always mobilize against something. And another footnote here, just look at how Salvini is dealing with the current issues within the Italian government. He's constantly somehow on the edge, trying to be in and out in order somehow to find as much as possible also some enemies within the government, because he doesn't want to lose his electoral attractiveness, which is always linked to finding enemies and criticizing enemies. Of course, the context is very, very complex for Salvini as well, but this is also why, especially in more recent times, we had an attempt, which may very well be followed by an abandonment of the government, an attempt to differentiate himself and the party, of course, from what the government is doing. And we had an abstention which goes exactly in this direction, but I would not want to go too much here in this direction. So elites also change. The definition of elites changed because neo-populist parties, once they move towards the government, they need to find other targets, because they lose some and they need to have others in order to continue their neo-populist rhetoric. Now, until very recently, neo-populism was studied simply in the electoral dimension. Because in Europe, if we focus on Europe and in the European case, which is my geographical focus, at least for now, we had several neo-populist parties that never really had a chance to be in government. And this is something very important to underline, because the whole party dynamic changes if you really have a chance to be in government and then you actually are in government. Because, and this is going back to the Italian case and Sartori's account of the Italian case, you are entitled not to be responsible if you're always in the opposition. There's no need then to give proof of what you say, because you'll never have a chance to govern. And this, Sartori was thinking about this when referring to the Communist Party and to the fact that there was virtually no chance that the Communist Party will be able to rule in Italy, and therefore also the promises could be out of any reasonable reading of how politics would work. Well, to a certain extent, the same applies to neopopulism. Until neopopulists govern, they can promise more or less whatever they want, because as long as they know that they will never have to show their cards once in government, then they can insist on a number of policy measures that may be impossible actually to then adopt. But once the populists, neo-populist parties go in government, what happens? Well, here we see very clear differences with reference to some dimensions that have been identified in the literature. And here we more clearly distinguish between exclusionary neo-populist parties and inclusionary ones. We use, in order to do this, three key dimensions: the political dimension, the symbolic dimension, and the material dimension. The political dimension regards participation. One of the key words of neo-populist parties was, we want democracy to work more properly. We want more participation. But here we have nuances in terms of who should participate. And in an exclusionary variant of neopopulism, those who should participate are the nativists, those who are really citizens and most likely have been long-term citizens of a given territory. And therefore, extending participation is seen as a political goal, but extending participation is seen as a political goal only for those, again, who are seen as nativists or those who are native of a given territory. So nativism is key in understanding this political goal. On the other hand, we have a more open reading of participation. Everyone should participate. Everyone that actually is in a given territory, notwithstanding if it is or it's not a native person. And here we have the inclusionary a la Podemos variant, and we have some evidence in the local policies that were supported and then implemented in Madrid and Barcelona that go very much in this direction. The same line of thought applies to the identity, that is the symbolic dimension, that is the people dimension that we have discussed so thoroughly until now. So I will not insist on this, but also on the people. We have who's part of the people, all those who are part of a territory. So they all are symbolically part of the unitary set of individuals. Or the people are only those that, again, are natives, those that share sovereignty goals, those who have long-lasting citizenship of a given territory. So on the one hand, the task is to increase participation. On the other hand, and this is the political dimension, on the other hand, the task is to embrace symbolically a unitary set of individuals rather than another. Third and final dimension, which is the dimension which is to a certain extent the one that becomes more problematic for those that actually do start to govern, the material dimension. Here we're speaking about welfare state, we're speaking about welfare benefits, we're speaking about incentives, economic incentives, a number of elements that deal with distribution or redistribution of resources. And here we have a clear division between inclusionary populism that is based on welfare universalism. So every single person that we find in a given territory should be targeted as a welfare beneficiary in case of need. On the other hand, we have the welfare chauvinists. So we have those who think that distribution and redistribution should occur only for those that are actually natives, for those who are citizens, long-lasting citizens of a given nation state. And this debate, for example, was at the heart of the Italian reddito di cittadinanza that actually has some very peculiar elements that are linked to the opportunity to actually have access to the benefit or not. Originally, the idea was to have a limited number of years in order to provide more inclusiveness. Then at the end, in the negotiation that occurred with the Lega, the number of years of being part of a territory was extended, and for this reason, the reddito di cittadinanza is not as inclusive as it could have been if other preferences were going to win. So, to conclude on the varieties of neopopulism, we have exclusionary and inclusionary variants. Historically speaking, the inclusionary variants were much more present in Latin America. Exclusionary variants were much more present in Europe. Now, over the past years, we have seen differentiation also in Europe in terms of growing numbers of inclusionary populist parties. Now, as you can see, this is very much in line with the numbers that you also find on the populist. You have a very substantial predominance of exclusionary neopopulist parties. Although after 2008, you had growing numbers of inclusionary neopopulist parties that actually, and this would be another piece of reflection that I'd like to share with you if I have time later on. After the economic crisis of 2008, a number of neopopulist, inclusionary neopopulist parties were formed. And this gave birth to the hypothesis of an economic crisis explanation of some inclusionary neopopulist parties, which has found substantial empirical confirmation in a number of cases. So going to the theory, towards the theory, and making sure that I finish in 5 minutes in order to give enough room for comments and questions. The crisis notion is something that is discussed at length by Laclau, and I think it's particularly useful because it allows us to identify the moments when specific factors become relevant for explaining neopopulism birth, origin, and consolidation. We have, again, lots of literature that tells us that a crisis has to be created, because crises may happen all the time, but crisis, and therefore you have to find some empirical foundations of crisis. You cannot say that we are in economic turmoil if the economy is going very well. You cannot say that you are in a political crisis if you have high voters turnout, if people trust parties, if people trust trade unions, and so on. But if people don't trust parties, if people do not trust trade unions or tend not to trust them anymore, and so on, then you have the conditions for a crisis to be performed. You have the conditions for a crisis to be performed. The crisis is not somehow objective, but it's induced by political actors that are using the information regarding problems in the economy, problems in the political sphere, problems in the cultural sphere in order to perform a crisis. And with this respect, the crisis becomes the point of departure of a neopopulist discourse. Still, if we want to try to draft a theory of neopopulism that goes beyond the European cases, then we also have to consider what happens in non-democratic regimes. And this is particularly important because it helps us also set a dialogue with the literature on the consequences of populism. So here, I think we can distinguish between authoritarian neopopulism versus democratic neopopulism. That is, where does neopopulism occur, in an authoritarian or a democratic context? Knowing that the rhetoric, elite people can also be used in a non-democratic regime. The same applies to the political strategy and to the communication style. Which crisis then? Political, economic, and cultural. These are the most important that we have seen over the past 20 years in Europe, but more broadly speaking, we could group the various crises in these macro types. Now, some could argue that we would need eventually to incorporate also the social crisis. So it could be political, economic, cultural, and social. My argument here, and I'm supported by some literature, is that the economic crisis may cover some of the social aspects that others have labeled as social crisis, or the cultural immigration crisis may also cover some of the social aspects that others have identified as a social crisis. So I would like to stick to these crises, and empirically speaking, political crisis is associated to very low trust in institutions, political parties, trade unions, low satisfaction with reference to democracy or with reference to the regimes. Economic crisis is linked to unemployment or employment performance, to GDP, and the usual suspects in terms of economic difficulties. And finally, cultural or immigration crisis is linked to the number of migrants or the number of asylum seekers, to the number of people that are seen as potential threats, especially when the definition of the people, symbolically speaking, is of natives. Okay, so we somehow started on this and we'll finish on this. So my understanding of how a neopopulism works is that you have an interplay of various crises that may be slightly different from case to case, from country to country. So we, for theoretical purposes, put them together. And of course, they be mutually reinforcing. The political crisis may reinforce the economic crisis and vice versa. And before we see what happens in terms of impact on the regime, we need to focus on leadership. This is where the crisis is performed. We could also label this facilitating factor as the crisis performance. It's the way through which the crisis is somehow used in order to increase the appeal of the new populist leader. And this is done in particular using media innovations. This is where the technological innovations regarding especially social media are of great importance. And if after this filter, then in authoritarian populism, you basically have regime consolidation. Putin in Russia so far has gone through every single crisis successfully by consolidating his power. Now, it will take, just to continue in this theoretical reasoning, it will take another leader capable of using the media innovations and challenge the frame that is provided by Putin as a populist leader. And Navalny, to a certain extent, if he'll survive, is trying to do this, if you think about it. But of course, it's in a context where he has a very limited opportunity because he cannot compete in a non-democratic regime. As for the democratic regimes, instead, we have populism that may give birth to democratic crises, and therefore I call it crisis, but I could call it democratic breakdown potential. And this is exactly what's happening in Hungary. To a certain extent, it's what's happening in Poland, where you have regimes that were never fully consolidated that now are going much more into a direction which is of a democratic illiberalism, not a liberal democratic case anymore. And on the other hand, we may have, and this may be a bit counterintuitive, we may have democratic reinvigoration because we have some inputs that allow institutions to be trust more than they used to, thanks to the presence of neo-populist parties. And this is, if you wish, an outcome of a broader conceptualization of populist parties and not seeing populist parties only as a threat, only as potentially violent, only as potentially illiberal. Of course, there is a potential illiberal germ in neopopulism. But this germ becomes a disease only in those cases when it's done on purpose by the political leadership. Podemos on the one hand, Rassemblement National on the other. In France, France Insoumise and Rassemblement National, they're both neopopulists, but they're both using people, the crisis, in very different ways. So within the French system, both may provide potential opportunities for democracy to be further consolidated. We may not like the choices, we may not like the policies, but how many other policies that are supported by non-populist parties do we like? Maybe we do not like them either. So it's not a question of challenging the system, of being anti-establishment. Neo-populist parties cannot be seen as anti-establishment since they decide to participate to the basic rules of the game, which is elections, participate to elections. So with this respect, and I really would like to finish here, what I'm trying to work on is this comparative, quite encompassing perspective. I have a pending book proposal for Oxford University Press that I hope to get done in the coming months. But it takes, as you can imagine, lots of energy and lots of knowledge, and the literature is just booming. So just being able to read everything that comes out on populism or neopopulism is an effort. So hopefully the summer will help me, and whatever comments or questions you may have will help me also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo, for your enlightening seminar presentation. I think that there are many things that are relevant, interesting to discuss. So I immediately leave the floor to the audience. So please, anyone who would like to ask a question to Paolo, please raise the hand, and we'll allow you immediately to directly ask the question. So please. Mattia, please. Thank you. Now I should be able to ask the question directly, Mattia.
Yeah, I can see now. I can speak. Okay. So thank you, Professor Graziano, for your presentation.
Yeah, can I see you, Mattia?
No, unfortunately, it's not his fault. It's the webinar that has
okay, sorry.
So let's check. Let's make immediately to try to promote as a member at some point. But,
but if it's too complicated,
yeah.
I don't want to. Yeah, sorry about that.
Because actually, if I promote to members, so Mattia, I don't know if now you can share the video, but it was so the webinar. This is the problem of the webinar, that make it possible to share the video for the audience. Mattia, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, but I cannot.
Yeah, sure. So go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for your presentation. I recently read Ernesto Laclau's book, Populist Reason, and I'd like to know your opinion about one of his main theses, which is that it's so difficult to highlight every feature of every populist party. So probably populism is just a dimension of political culture, is not an ideology, and I think this completely destroys the ideology definition of populism. And if you agree with this, how you match this idea of populism as a reason or logic with your distinction between authoritarian and democratic populism?
How shall we proceed? Shall we answer one by one, or shall we?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you, Mattia. Indeed, we would need a bit more time to use Laclau. So I'll try to be brief, and hopefully I will be convincing. Now, as you know, since you have read the book, Laclau is not easy to read. Let's start with a very elementary point. Laclau is not an easy read. The various components of his thought are not that easy to decipher, because some of them are a bit ambiguous, if you wish. But let me take your point about the lack of ideology, or the fact that populism is not an ideology, but it's something else. It's a way through which politics manifests itself. I fully agree with Laclau, but I add to Laclau something that Laclau himself has also looked at, which is the notion of empty signifier. And I'm sure you understand what I'm referring to. And I'm trying to translate this to all those who have not read Laclau. How does populism work? The idea is that populism works in a political system because it uses the notion of people as an empty signifier. So somehow it puts into the notion of people whoever can be mobilized for electoral purposes. So with this respect, this can be seen as a thin ideology. My counter-argument with respect to Laclau is that I buy 99% of what Laclau tells us, but there's 1% that should be changed. And that's the reading of, again, the thin-centered ideology. We may label it differently. Again, in the neopopulist literature, they really fight each other. So I see somehow your point. If you take an ideational approach, you'll be criticized by those who follow Laclau. If you take a Laclauian approach, Kasmud, as he did once in a seminar we co-organized, he would say, well, you're not taking my approach, and it cuts every debate. Well, I don't think that's the best way to go. I do think that if we take Laclau seriously, and taking Laclau seriously, meaning sometimes also trying to translate some of his sentences, which are not obscure would be too much, but not crystal clear. And you try to link them to a broader reading of populism, then the fact that today's society, I would say, today's political society is populated by populist parties, it's not surprising at all, because the empty signifier has been somehow filled by the various definitions of the people that have been provided by the new political leaders. In a study conducted some years ago with a colleague of mine that was published in the Italian Political Science Review, we show how between 2004 and 2014, we didn't get up to the 2019 European elections, there has been an increase in the aggregate populist features of the Italian political system. Looking at the electoral manifestos between 2004 and 2014, populism spread in a number of parties that would have never been seen as populist before 2004. So I'm trying to say that using Laclau and taking Laclau very seriously, I think this theory becomes even more relevant, because this is where we find Laclau to be very simple. We find Laclau in the usage of the crisis. The empty signifier is populated by the crisis that determine the antagonistic relationship between the people and the elite.
Thank you, Paolo. There is another couple of questions. The first by George. Can you ask directly?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for presentation as well, Dr. Graziano. Well, I was just wondering if you could either provide us some sources or maybe bring up some cases on the topic of switching of elites between the so-called corrupt elite and the people, and the antagonistic relationship between these two.
Yeah, there we go. Well, the examples could be numerous, but I think just to remain in the Italian landscape, we had a very interesting phenomenon, which is still an important phenomenon, political phenomenon, which is the 5-star movement in the Italian case. I mentioned other cases during my talk. So now let me just focus for a few minutes on the five-star movement. Now, the five-star movement, as we all know, originated thanks to an intuition by a political leader and a political communicator. Well, actually, a communicator that was not political before meeting the political leader. The political leader being Grillo, the communicator, becoming political communicator, being Casaleggio. Now, what was the rhetoric used on a constant basis by Grillo and then by others still today? Today, we'll see the problem of the five-star movement is exactly the fact that it went into government, but it had to go into a government in a coalition. So many things happen. This is another story. Focusing on the elite people antagonistic relationship. Grillo started out, among other things, by organizing the so-called Vaffa Day. What was the Vaffa Day? It was a moment, a collective, cathartic moment where you could insult all those who were seen as elites. And you really had a changing, an evolving number of representative of the elites that were in this bunch. This was somehow the beginning, but then it continued. And in another article that I worked on together with other colleagues on comparing the five-star movement, Syriza and Podemos, we showed very well how the five-star movement was always trying to target an elite. And where do we find this before the five-star movement enters into the parliament? We find it in the Thanksgiving speeches of Grillo that are packed of criticism. Before insults, then growingly it turns into criticism towards the banks, towards the European Union, European institutions, towards the multinationals. So you have both economic and political elites, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the classic repertoire of enemies of the people, of enemies of the hard worker, of the layman or laywoman that is outside of that picture. And if you think about this type of discourse and the success it had in the Italian case, well, we could really say that it was very well taken. And it was explicitly dividing the 1% corrupt elite of the world, of Europe, of Italy, and the 99%, the pure people. Now, of course, the 199% goes back also to other social movements. But again, it's at the heart of neopopulism to antagonize the very small minority that, according to neopopulists, are actually ruling, and the huge majority, which is the people. That is not 100%. So yes, it's a unitary set, but it's not as unitary as you could think if you took the unitary definition as 100% valid. There always is some room for the elites. Otherwise, there will be no antagonistic relationship. But the idea is that the elites are not the people. And the elites are therefore the enemy, and they will always be the enemy because they cannot be included into the people. Mattia, sorry, also George, is this okay? Convincing? Yeah, I didn't see your name. Sorry, George.
Yes, George Rhetoric is here. Perfect. Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Paolo, there is another question actually from an anonymous in the audience, so I cannot give him or her directly his voice or her voice. So let me ask you, is it possible, read and ask then, is it possible to give example of populist movements that lead to democratic reinvigoration?
My argument would be that Podemos in Spain has done this very clearly by this, in the sense that not only it provided new formulas for the country, it has in 10 years we had a movement that was coming from a very harsh economic crisis, indignados, that then was translated into a social movement, then a political party. And the story of Podemos is absolutely fascinating because it was a sort of a laboratory experiment, because Pablo Iglesias got his PhD at the European University Institute. He worked with Donatella Della Porta. You may want to ask Donatella Della Porta when she will come. As far as I know, but she will have all the details, she worked with Della Porta, and on the side, Della Porta is increasingly working on populism, but she's a social movement scholar, a brilliant social movement scholar. He, together with other colleagues at Carlos III in Madrid, coming from political science, working on Laclau, they said, hey, this is the perfect moment to perform a crisis. This is the perfect moment to take advantage from the economic situation, from the political situation, which is a critical one, and build a new political party. And I would argue that some of the topics that are currently under debate in the Spanish governments are very original and new. In this sense, reinvigoration means also providing new topics that were not there before. An example that comes from a spin-off of Podemos is the working time reduction experiment, which has been supported by the government. Is it a good or a bad idea? We can discuss it in another moment. The point is that it's new, it's reinvigorating, and it's not anti-democratic. On the contrary, it's deepening. It could be seen as deepening economic democracy to a certain extent.
Thank you, Paolo. I don't see if there is any other questions. I actually have one, so let me also allow to ask you one thing. It's about the relation between populism and direct democracy. It seems to me that there is not a lot of analysis, at least in the economic literature, of populism. While it seems to me that actually, and for instance, in Italy, the Five-Star Movement and other examples abroad actually may actually inspire the fact that there is a direct link between a more demand for direct democracy, or perhaps also less trust not only on politicians but on the representative democracy. The same idea of actually selection a political class from the Five-Star Movement is very interesting, because it's the idea that actually it's not an expert, the politician, it's not someone who has better information or more talent, but actually is this kind of identification is almost one of the citizens, which is randomly drawn from the pool of people that belong to the, and actually, in fact, those who are represented, they have to translate directly the will of the member of the parties in their political action in the legislation. Second, actually, question which is related about this also this distrust, and so the idea which is the relation between populism and demand for direct democracy, and also later I will ask you if you have any actually suggestion, things to read, and the second one is about the relation between actually populism and distrust towards the elite in other dimension. So which is actually the correlation, because is the populists that actually reinforce distrust for the expert, or the other way around, which is another phenomenon. And we know when talking about now about vaccine and the COVID-19, so the fact that there's also distrust in general towards the expert, the science sometimes, for similar reason, because also the expert may be biased. There are some pharma big company that can actually bias this expert. So this is a kind of consequence of the populism, or is actually simply a reinforced phenomenon of the populism? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. On populism and direct democracy, this is the participation political dimension that has been addressed by the literature with reference to one of the key features that is common to all neo-populist parties, that is, we want a different form of democracy because representative democracy is not working as it should. So indeed, I will then send you some references to this subject, especially in terms of the conceptualization of direct democracy. But beyond this, let me just say that on the one hand, we had the myth of direct democracy. That is, that neopopulist parties, especially some neopopulist parties, the newest, I would say, the ones that are actually appeared on the political scene more recently, they really focused on the problems of representative democracy and said, underlined the relevance of new forms of representation that could also go beyond representation as such. But if you take a case of the 5-star movement, there's a very well-written article by Lorenzo Mosca and Filippo Tronconi that I can share, that appeared in the West European Politics Journal. They show very well how the direct democracy aspect of the 5-star movement is completely in the hands of the leader, or completely in the hands of the leadership. So it does not follow classic referendum-like or referenda-like patterns, but rather it's a myth that is used in order to capture traction and therefore to capture votes, among other things, but then is also domesticated empirically in order to avoid any kind of voice which is not in line with the preferences of the leadership. So it's a fake direct democracy quite often, in the numbers, in the arguments, in the posts that are deleted. So to beyond the case of the 5-star movement, there is this quest, this desire for different types of democracy, which go very much in line with direct forms of democracy. But then the neo-populist parties play with it in a very complicated manner. But it's not surprising, I would argue, because if you took the direct democracy element to the end, the only reason why you could justify the fact that as a neo-populist party, you're participating to elections is that you want to change the representative system into a direct one. So unless you obtain the full majority, you will never go in government. And this was the original position by Grillo. Of course, we do not know if it was just said to be said. I mean, facts show that they did go into a coalition. But this is the reason why it's not that easy to do substantive research, because either you focus on the recruitment of the politicians, or you focus on the electoral manifesto declarations. Otherwise, once in government, well, this component becomes, yes, it's present, but it's not direct democracy for sure. It's a different style of representative democracy, which is most likely what was wanted by the electorate. So not to say that it's not relevant, but it's something different with reference to a direct democracy. Trust and neopopulism. Now here, as you can imagine, the reverse causality issue is one of the most problematic issues that have emerged in a number of quantitative analysis. One of the key research question was, do neo-populist party increase trust towards the political systems or not? And we have different contributions. Well, some of them are very convincing in terms of the causal links. But if we take all the studies together, we have a relatively recent meta-analysis that has been conducted. We do not have that very powerful evidence that tells us that everywhere neopopulism increases trust towards institutions. This is the first point of the answer. So it really very much depends on the types of neopopulism and on the types of crises. So if we have an economic crisis and we have inclusionary neopopulists, it's highly likely that trust in institutions, if the neopopulist party is successful, it's highly likely that trust in institutions will increase. And the same may apply to a cultural crisis, exclusionary neopopulism, trust in institutions. Your question, the second part of the question, though, is different, and it's a very relevant one. It could be a very good idea for a joint work, I would also say. because it tries to focus on one aspect, which is expertise. Now, we do have a couple of studies. We had a seminar with somebody, actually Heribert Su from the University of Zurich, who just published an article in the American Journal of Political Science together with Daniele Caramani. And they look at the attitudes towards technocracy and experts in neopopulist electoral attitudes or attitudes and voters. What comes out is that at the end of the day, there's not a great difference among the various electorates. So it's not that neopopulists do not trust tech experts more than non-neopopulist parties. It's much more equally distributed. But this is a very first attempt to empirically look at the picture. We would need, I think, also to have another type of research design that goes in the other way, that is to see what happens when neopopulist parties are in government and how they eventually may change their relationship to experts in policies. And this is really the stress test, if you wish, of this kind of research question. But it's absolutely fascinating, I think.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so we are really grateful. It was a really great speech today, and I'm sure that we all enjoy a lot. So thank you again, not only to Paolo, Valentine, and everyone has attended this seminar, and thank you again. And I hope to see you all on May 10th for the next seminar. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.